When red wine spilled across the $48,000 rental gown I wore to my son's wedding, I didn't shout, cry, or make a scene. I looked straight at my daughter-in-law, Camille Whitmore, who stood there pretending to be shocked, and I knew immediately it wasn't an accident. In that moment, surrounded by 300 guests watching in silence, I understood what she wanted: to embarrass me, to remind everyone that her family's money and power made her untouchable. I smiled, turned around, and walked out of that ballroom with wine dripping down the beadwork. By the time I reached my car, I had already decided exactly what I would do. After 30 years investigating corporate misconduct, I wasn't about to let anyone humiliate me and get away with it. 3 months later, the Whitmore family empire was under federal investigation, all because of that one glass of wine. Let me tell you how it happened, because the truth is buried in the smallest details. The Whitmore estate in Connecticut looked like a palace that afternoon. Endless marble, chandeliers the size of small cars, and 300 guests dressed as if they had all stepped out of a magazine. The Whitmores had spared no expense for the wedding of their only daughter, Camille, to my son, Michael. I remember standing near the back of the ballroom, smiling politely, trying to blend into the crowd even though I knew I didn't belong. The servers floated around carrying trays of champagne. The string quartet played something classical and impossibly expensive, and everywhere I looked there were people who lived in a world where a single dinner party cost more than my yearly salary when I was working. I was wearing the gown Camille had suggested I rent, a silver-beaded couture piece valued at $48,000. She had called it a gift, though, of course, it wasn't really that. It was a test, a silent way to remind me that this was her world now, not mine. Still, I played along. I wanted peace for Michael's sake. When the ceremony ended and the reception began, the air smelled of roses and old money. I was chatting with one of Michael's college friends, telling an old story about how my son once tried to build a rocket out of soda bottles when it happened. I lifted my glass of water, gesturing as I spoke, and a single drop, one, slipped over the rim and landed near the hem of Camille's wedding gown. I froze immediately. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I said, reaching down with my napkin to blot it, my voice calm but my heart suddenly pounding. Camille looked down at me with a polite little smile that didn't reach her eyes. For half a second, something flickered there, something sharp, deliberate. And then, before I could move, she gasped loudly, stepped back, and her hand tilted. Her wineglass tipped forward, sending a full pour of deep red wine splashing down the front of my gown. It spread instantly, across the beaded silk, down to the floor, blooming like blood on snow. "Oh no," she cried, her voice theatrical enough to make half the guests turn. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn. I'm just so clumsy when I'm startled." Her tone was honey-sweet, but her eyes were ice. Around us the music faltered, the chatter died, and 300 people stared. Some whispered, some smirked. And Camille stood there, the perfect bride, pretending to be horrified while watching me drown in humiliation. I could have yelled. I could have thrown the wine back at her. But instead I did the only thing that ever really works in rooms like that. I smiled. A slow, steady smile that made her blink. "Don't worry about it, darling," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Accidents happen, though I imagine the rental company will be quite upset. $48,000 is a lot of money, even for an accident." Her face twitched, just slightly, and I turned away before she could answer. The crowd parted as I walked toward the garden exit, the music stuttering back to life behind me. I could feel their eyes following me, some pitying, some amused, but I kept my chin high and my pace steady. Outside, the early evening air was cool and damp, the sky heavy with the kind of rain that never really decides whether to fall or not. The drops began just as I reached the edge of the terrace, soft and cold against my skin. By the time I reached the driveway, the drizzle had turned to real rain. My gown, the same one Camille had chosen, clung to my legs, streaked with dark red stains that shimmered under the estate's golden lights. I stopped beside my car, watching the wine mix with the rainwater as it pooled at my feet. People like the Whitmores believed they could buy respect, control perception, and erase consequence. But I'd spent 3 decades investigating people exactly like them, the kind who built their fortunes on deceit and thought no one would ever notice. Standing there, soaked and shivering, I made a quiet promise, not out of anger, but out of principle. Camille Whitmore had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life, and she didn't even know it yet. 3 days after the wedding, the invoice arrived. It was printed on heavy white paper with gold lettering, as if elegance could disguise the insult. Payment due, $56,800 for damages beyond repair. I stared at the number for a long time, sitting in the quiet of my small cottage by Lake Champlain in Vermont. The lake was calm that morning, a flat sheet of gray reflecting a sky that looked ready to snow. My coffee had gone cold beside me, untouched. The wine-stained gown hung near the window, still damp in places despite my attempt to clean it. Its silver beadwork caught the light, but the red stains had darkened into something that looked almost alive. $56,800? For a dress I didn't even own. I should have been angry. Maybe I was. But more than anything, I felt a sharp clarity, the kind that comes after humiliation, when the noise fades and the logic starts working again. That's the thing about numbers. They never lie. The phone rang just as I reached for my checkbook. The caller ID flashed Michael. I took a deep breath before answering. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice too soft, too careful. "I wanted to call you before Camille did." I could already tell where this was going. "She feels terrible about what happened," he continued. "She's been crying for days. Dad Whitmore wanted me to tell you that he insists on covering the cost of the gown." I kept my tone even. "That's very generous," I said, "but tell him I already paid it." There was a pause, a long one. You paid it?" Michael asked, confused. "I did," I replied. "Consider it my lesson fee." "Mom, that's ridiculous. You shouldn't have to." "I wanted to," I cut in gently. "It's my responsibility. Accidents happen." The word accidents hung in the air like smoke. We both knew I didn't believe it. Michael hesitated. "Camille swears she didn't mean to." I didn't let him finish. "Of course she didn't," I said. "I'm sure she was just startled." I heard him exhale, the sound of relief and guilt tangled together. He wanted peace. He always did. He was too good at believing people meant well. "I love you, Mom," he said finally. "I know you do," I replied, and then I ended the call before my voice could betray me. The house was silent again, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock. Outside, snow had begun to fall, slow, deliberate flakes drifting down to the lake's edge. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked at the dress. The stains had spread even deeper overnight, sinking into the silk like a bruise that wouldn't heal. I had thought about sending it to a professional cleaner, maybe even back to the boutique in New York, but something stopped me. Instead, I left it hanging there, a reminder. The Whitmores had built an empire on control, controlling appearances, narratives, people. And in that moment, it hit me that Camille's accident wasn't just about pride. It was about power. She wanted me to feel small in her world, to see myself as an outsider who didn't belong. But she had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was powerless. I'd spent 30 years as a corporate compliance investigator, following paper trails and exposing lies hidden behind polished spreadsheets. I knew how to read patterns, how to follow inconsistencies until they told the truth no one wanted to see. That skill never really goes away. It just waits for a reason to wake up. I walked to the closet, opened the door, and looked at the wine-stained gown again. The fabric shimmered faintly in the gray morning light. "You shouldn't have underestimated an investigator," I whispered. Then I closed the closet door and sat down at my desk. Beside my laptop was a stack of old business cards, contacts from my years in corporate work, names that opened doors ordinary people couldn't reach. I pulled one out at random, stared at it, then opened my computer. If the Whitmores wanted to play games with money, I was going to play mine with truth. And I never lose when the numbers are on my side. It started quietly, the way most important things do. No big plan, no dramatic montage, just me, a cup of coffee, and my laptop on the kitchen table overlooking the frozen lake. The sun hadn't even risen when I typed the words Whitmore Holdings into a search bar. The company's website looked as perfect as I expected, polished language about sustainability, global partnerships, and family legacy. A glossy homepage filled with photos of cargo ships, oil rigs, and smiling employees wearing hard hats. It was a masterpiece of corporate storytelling, the kind that only very expensive lawyers and PR teams can build. But I wasn't interested in their story. I wanted their numbers. Over the next few hours, I moved from public financial filings to archived tax documents, cross-referencing old subsidiary names I half remembered from industry reports. 30 years in corporate compliance teaches you that no company is too big to hide something. They just get better at burying it. At first glance, Whitmore Holdings looked clean, cleaner than I expected. Every audit, every investor report lined up neatly. But neatness was often the first red flag. Perfection in finance doesn't exist. By noon, my eyes were burning from the screen light. I leaned back in my chair, rubbed my temples, and looked around my small Vermont cottage. The piles of books, the stacks of case folders I never threw away, the smell of coffee turning bitter in the mug. I realized how natural this felt. The process, the focus, the hunt. I hadn't missed the corporate world, but I had missed this. The quiet satisfaction of following a thread no one else could see. That evening, I called Diane Rowe. Diane and I had started together at the same firm decades ago. She'd stayed longer than I had, climbing into a senior audit position at one of the country's top compliance consultancies. If anyone could get me access to the kind of databases the public never sees, it was her. Evelyn? Her voice came through the speakerphone, warm but cautious. It's been a long time. I know, I said. I wouldn't call if it wasn't important. She laughed softly. You always say that right before you do something reckless. What's going on? I need access to the federal corporate registry and trade records, the ones that include foreign partnerships. You still have clearance? A pause. Technically, yes. But why, Evelyn? You're retired. You don't even like the work anymore. I hesitated. You ever hear of Whitmore Holdings? Another pause, longer this time. Of course. Shipping and energy, huge conglomerate. Why are you interested? I glanced at the stained gown hanging in the corner. Even from across the room, I could still see the faint maroon streaks along the hem. Let's just say, I replied slowly, something about their business practices has my attention. Diane sighed. Evelyn, be honest with me. Is this about revenge? I smiled to myself. No, Diane. It's about truth. Revenge is just the interest rate. She let out a short, exasperated laugh. You haven't changed a bit. Send me what you can, I said. Subsidiary lists, offshore filings, anything tied to maritime logistics. I'll take care of the rest. You realize if this blows back, I was never involved, she warned. Of course not, I said. You were just catching up with an old friend. After we hung up, I stared at the computer screen for a long time. Outside, the lake had begun to freeze around the edges, the wind scraping softly against the window panes. It reminded me of how data behaves, layers forming on the surface, hiding movement underneath. You can't see the danger until the cracks appear. The email from Diane arrived after midnight. Attached were several encrypted files and a single line in the message. You didn't get this from me. Be careful. I downloaded everything and started digging. Line after line of ledger entries scrolled across the screen. Transactions, partnerships, subsidiaries. At first, it was all noise, but then something caught my eye. A payment trail from a Whitmore subsidiary called Maritime Energy Solutions to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands under a company name I didn't recognize. Blue Shore Exports Limited. On paper, it was listed as a logistics consultant, but there was no website, no employee record, no physical address, just a mailbox in Georgetown. The transaction amount, $3.4 million. Purpose, consulting fees. No legitimate shipping company pays that much money for consulting. I zoomed out, cross-checking the dates. The payment lined up perfectly with a sudden spike in declared expenses for the same quarter, almost as if someone had needed to hide the money quickly. That was the moment the adrenaline kicked in, the old thrill I hadn't felt in years. Somewhere in that mountain of data, the Whitmores were hiding something, and I was going to find it. The wine on my dress might have been a stain to everyone else. To me, it was a starting point. The email came 2 days after I found the Cayman Islands transaction. Short and perfectly polite. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Richard Whitmore Sr., would be delighted if you could join him for lunch at Romano's on Thursday. He would like to personally thank you for attending the wedding and discuss a possible consulting opportunity. Regards, Patricia Webb, Executive Assistant. The moment I saw his name, I knew exactly what this was. A soft warning wrapped in silk. Romano's was one of those old Boston institutions where the waiters wear white jackets and the tables are set far enough apart for private conversations. I hadn't been there in years. When I walked in, the host led me straight to a corner table overlooking the harbor. Richard Whitmore was already seated, a glass of red wine in his hand. He stood as I approached. Mrs. Carter, he said warmly, extending his hand. Thank you for coming. Of course, I replied, shaking it. His grip was firm, practiced, the kind of handshake that said I'm in control. He gestured for me to sit. I hope you don't mind, he said, signaling to the waiter. I took the liberty of ordering the Bordeaux. 2012 vintage, a personal favorite of mine. I smiled politely. How thoughtful. The waiter poured him a glass and turned to me. I stopped him with a slight wave of my hand. Water, please. Richard raised an eyebrow but said nothing. For a few minutes we made small talk, the kind that dances around real meaning. He asked about Vermont, about retirement, about how proud I must be of Michael and Camille. I gave him short, neutral answers. I'd sat across from men like him my entire career, the kind who never said what they meant until they thought they'd already won. Finally, he leaned back, swirling his wine. You spent many years in corporate compliance, didn't you? 30, I said, mostly investigating financial misconduct. Ah, yes, a difficult field. He smiled faintly. You must have seen things that could ruin people's lives if handled improperly. That's true, I replied evenly, but I was trained to handle them properly. He chuckled softly, as if amused by a private joke. I respect that. In fact, that's partly why I wanted to meet. I think a woman with your background could be useful. Useful? Yes. He set his glass down. Our company is expanding into several new markets, complex international operations. We're looking for consultants who understand how to navigate, shall we say, sensitive situations. The phrasing was deliberate. The word sensitive in corporate language rarely means ethical. I see, I said carefully. And what kind of situations would those be? He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Situations where things might not add up perfectly on paper, but where it's better for everyone if they quietly align. There. It was the test. He wasn't offering me a job. He was offering me a leash. We could use someone like you, he continued smoothly, someone who knows how to make problems disappear quietly. I took a sip of my water, holding his gaze. I see. And would this be a temporary engagement or something more permanent? He shrugged lightly. Let's consider it a trial run. We compensate our consultants very generously. Generously, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. He nodded, clearly waiting for me to take the bait. I smiled, a calm, steady smile that he mistook for agreement. Well, I said, it certainly sounds intriguing. Excellent. His expression relaxed. My assistant will send you the documents tomorrow. Standard consulting agreement, some initial project materials. Nothing too demanding. I'm sure you'll find the work interesting. I'm sure I will. We spent another 10 minutes exchanging pleasantries before the waiter brought the check. Richard insisted on paying, of course, and I didn't argue. I'd learned long ago that men like him measured respect through small gestures of control. When we stood, he offered his hand again. It's been a pleasure, Mrs. Carter. I think this will be the beginning of a mutually beneficial relationship. I shook his hand once more, matching his tone. I'm sure it will be, Mr. Whitmore. As I left the restaurant, the winter sun hit the harbor, turning the water a pale, cold blue. I walked past the line of parked cars, replaying every word of our conversation in my head. Richard Whitmore thought he'd just bought himself a new ally, someone smart enough to clean up his messes but naive enough to stay quiet. He had no idea he'd just hired his own problem. Back inside, through the restaurant window, I could see him lift his glass of Bordeaux to his lips. I watched the deep red shimmer in the light, then turned away. No, I murmured to myself, I'll stick with water. The courier arrived on Monday morning with a leather-bound folder embossed with the Whitmore Holdings logo. Inside were the consulting contract, non-disclosure agreements, and a stack of documents labeled preliminary review materials. The language was polished, the pay rate absurdly generous, and the confidentiality clause worded just carefully enough to suggest that someone, somewhere, had something to hide. By Wednesday, I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor of Whitmore Tower in downtown Boston, wearing a professional smile that didn't reach my eyes. The view stretched across the harbor, sunlight glinting off the cargo ships below, the perfect metaphor for the company itself. Massive, powerful, and built on the illusion of transparency. Richard's assistant, Patricia Webb, greeted me with the forced warmth of someone instructed to be polite. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Carter. Mr. Whitmore asked that you start by reviewing the due diligence files for our subsidiary operations. Just a routine audit, of course. Of course? I spent the first few days quietly observing. People smile too much in this building. Everyone seemed nervous, eager, rehearsed, like actors in a play they didn't fully understand. Their workstations were immaculate, their numbers even more so. Too even. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. Consistent profits, balanced expenses, tidy ledgers. But perfection in accounting is like silence in nature, unnatural, and usually a sign that something's wrong. The first red flag appeared in a set of philanthropic activity reports. According to the documents, Whitmore Holdings had donated millions to 3 nonprofit organizations over the past 5 years: the Maritime Heritage Trust, the International Trade Education Fund, and the Caribbean Development Initiative. Each was described as a cornerstone of our corporate responsibility program. Their financial reports, however, told a different story. Maritime Heritage Trust, for instance, had received $4.6 million in cultural preservation grants, but had no staff listed, no physical address beyond a post office box, and no record of any actual projects. The International Trade Education Fund had donated $1.2 million to itself. And the Caribbean Development Initiative? It didn't even exist in the Federal Charity Registry. All 3 organizations I discovered shared the same treasurer, Camille Whitmore. I sat back in my chair, staring at the name on the screen. The same woman who had smiled at me over spilled wine now sat at the center of a corporate structure that smelled like fraud dressed up as generosity. Later that afternoon, while reviewing shipment data in the financial systems, I noticed something stranger: duplicate transfers listed under different account numbers, but sharing identical timestamps. Money moving in 2 directions at once, one path clean, the other disappearing into shell entities. That night, I went home exhausted but wired. I poured a glass of water, not wine, and sat by the window overlooking the dark lake. The city lights reflected on the water, bright and distant. I thought about Camille's carefully composed smile, Richard's polished charm, Michael's blind loyalty. All of it was built on illusion. The next morning, as I stepped out of the elevator at Whitmore Tower, a woman was waiting for me in the lobby. Sharp suit, government badge clipped to her belt. "Mrs. Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Agent Sophia Reyes, Treasury Department. I believe we have a few mutual interests." Her handshake was firm, her tone professional but direct. "I understand you used to work in corporate compliance," she said as we walked toward a quiet corner of the cafe across the street. "I did," I said. 30 years. "Then you already know how deep this kind of thing can go," she replied. "The Whitmores have been on our radar for years, but we've never been able to prove anything. Every trail ends in offshore accounts or fake charities." "Maybe you were looking in the wrong place," I said. She studied me carefully. "You're playing with fire, Miss Carter." I smiled, stirring my coffee. "Good thing I'm fireproof." We exchanged contact information and agreed to stay in touch. She didn't need to ask whether I was officially cooperating. We both knew what I was doing wasn't sanctioned. Not yet. But people like us understood that justice rarely waited for permission. Back at the office, I continued my review, now with sharper focus. I dug deeper into the Whitmore's subsidiaries, mapping the flow of money between divisions and tracing every charitable transfer. And that's when I saw it, a series of payments from Whitmore Shipping East to Maritime Heritage Trust, totaling nearly $10 million over 2 years. The transactions were marked as cultural preservation partnerships, yet each one coincided with international shipments routed through Caribbean ports. Maritime Heritage Trust wasn't just a fake charity, it was a laundering channel. And Camille Whitmore, my daughter-in-law, was the one running it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the spreadsheet glowing on my monitor. The numbers didn't just tell a story, they screamed it. The Whitmores weren't just unethical, they were criminals. The only question now was how much evidence I could gather before they realized I was already inside their empire. The invitation came from Michael, not Camille, which told me everything I needed to know. When she wanted something, she made him deliver it. "Mom," he said over the phone, "Camille thought it would be nice to have you over for dinner this weekend. Just the 3 of us. She wants to make things right after everything." Everything. That was his polite word for humiliation. I paused long enough to make him uncomfortable. "Of course," I said finally. "Tell her I'd love to." Saturday evening, I drove down from Vermont to their new house in Greenwich, a colonial-style mansion with too many rooms and not enough warmth. It was the kind of place people bought to prove something, not to live in. When I pulled into the circular driveway, the front door opened before I even reached the steps. Camille stood there, smiling in a way that looked rehearsed. Evelyn, you made it. She kissed the air near my cheek, her perfume sharp and expensive. You look wonderful. So do you, I replied, which was true in a technical sense. She looked flawless, polished, glowing, perfectly curated, the kind of beauty that comes from money and control. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have hosted a board meeting. The table was set for 12, though only 3 places had been laid. I noticed the crystal glasses, the imported wine, the silver engraved with the Whitmore crest. Every detail screamed status. Michael tried to fill the silence with small talk about work, the weather, the renovations. Camille smiled at all the right moments, laughed when appropriate, but her eyes never left me. She was studying me, searching for cracks, waiting for a reaction. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared, she leaned back and said casually, I hope the files Daddy gave you were sufficient for your work. Her tone was light, but the question wasn't. I set down my fork. Oh, they were more than sufficient, I said, meeting her gaze. Quite enlightening, actually, especially the offshore routes. It was subtle, just enough to sound like a harmless comment, but the way her smile froze told me she understood exactly what I meant. Michael glanced between us, clearly lost. Offshore routes? He asked. Camille's hand tightened around her wine glass. Daddy's shipping records, she said quickly. They can be quite complex. I'm sure they are, I replied, taking a sip of water. Complex systems tend to hide simple truths. The silence that followed was dense enough to hear the clock ticking from the hallway. Camille recovered first. Well, I'm glad you're finding the work interesting. Daddy speaks very highly of you. I'm sure he does, I said, though I suspect not as highly as he did last week. Michael frowned. Mom? It's fine, Camille interrupted, her smile returning, brittle this time. We're all family now. No need for tension. No, tension at all, I said. I find these things fascinating. We finished dinner with the kind of strained politeness that makes time slow down. Camille kept her expression neutral, but the faint flush along her neck betrayed her. Michael kept refilling her glass, trying to smooth the edges neither of us cared to hide. When I stood to leave, Camille followed me to the door. I hope this visit helped clear the air, she said, her voice low enough that Michael couldn't hear. It did, I replied. Now I can see things much more clearly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Be careful, Evelyn. Some things are better left uncomplicated. I smiled. That's funny. I was just thinking the same thing. The drive home was long and quiet. The highway was nearly empty, the rhythmic sweep of the wipers the only sound inside the car. I replayed every line of that dinner, every glance, every hesitation. Camille had slipped, just enough to confirm that she knew what I'd found. She wasn't afraid yet, but she was watching. And people who watch closely eventually reveal what they're protecting. It was nearly midnight when I reached my cottage. Snow had started to fall again, covering the driveway in a thin white sheet. I hung up my coat, made tea, and was halfway to bed when the phone rang. The caller ID read, Whitmore Legal Department. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. Mrs. Carter? A woman's voice, efficient, polite. Mr. Whitmore asked that I schedule a meeting with you Monday morning at 9. He'd like to review and update the scope of your consulting project. Of course, I said calmly. Tell him I'll be there. After I hung up, I stood for a long moment watching the snow pile up outside the window. The call hadn't been about updating scope. It was about control, about drawing lines, about limiting what I could touch, which meant I had finally touched something they didn't want me to see. Monday morning, the sky over Boston was the same shade of gray as the steel and glass towers downtown. Whitmore Tower stood at the center of it all, 30 stories of polished intimidation. As I walked into the lobby, I could already feel the shift. The smiles from the reception staff were thinner now, practiced, their eyes following me just a little too long. Patricia Webb met me by the elevators, holding a folder close to her chest like a shield. Mr. Whitmore will see you now, she said. No warmth, no small talk. Richard's office occupied half the top floor. When I stepped in, he was standing by the window looking out at the harbor, the same harbor where his cargo ships moved quietly in and out every day, loaded with the kind of secrets only money could move. Evelyn, he said, turning toward me with a smile that didn't touch his eyes, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please, sit. I remained standing. I understand there's been a change in my contract? Not a change, he said smoothly. A clarification. He motioned to the folder on his desk. We realized that the original scope of work might have been overly ambitious. I'd like you to focus solely on domestic compliance from now on. Office operations, efficiency audits, things like that. Leave the international subsidiaries to our internal team. Your internal team, I repeated. The same team that's been filing duplicate transactions and routing millions through offshore charities? He didn't blink, but the pause that followed was enough. I'm not accusing you of anything, of course, I continued, just clarifying what I'd be avoiding. Richard smiled, but this time it looked forced. Evelyn, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We appreciate your thoroughness, but this company runs on trust. Too much digging can disrupt that balance. Trust, I said quietly, is earned with honesty, not silence. He folded his hands. You've been around long enough to know that truth and business rarely travel together. I'm simply suggesting you stay within your lane. Sign the updated contract, finish your work, and we can both move on. I picked up the folder and skimmed the document. The revisions were precise, every clause rewritten to limit my access to financial data, every line crafted to make my previous work look like an internal review instead of an investigation. If I signed it, they'd have me boxed in, legally and morally. I closed the folder and looked him straight in the eye. You think I need your money, Richard? What I need is the truth. The smile vanished. His voice dropped an octave. Family can be fragile, Evelyn, especially when outside influences create unnecessary tension. There it was, the threat, subtle but unmistakable. My family, I said evenly, will survive honesty just fine. He stood, moving to the window again. I'd hate to see Michael caught in the middle of something unpleasant. He already is, I replied. Richard turned back to me, his expression colder than the glass behind him. I'm giving you a chance to walk away from this. No harm done. You'll still get paid for your time. Paid to forget? I asked. That's not in my job description. The air in the room felt heavy. Outside, the harbor looked calm, but I knew better. Calm water always hid dangerous currents. Finally, I set the folder back on his desk. I won't be signing this. Richard exhaled slowly, then nodded, a small gesture that somehow felt like a closing door. That's unfortunate, he said. I had hoped this could remain simple. It was never simple, I said. You made sure of that. I turned and walked out before he could answer. Patricia looked up as I passed her desk, but I didn't stop. In the elevator, my reflection stared back at me from the mirrored wall, calm, composed, but with that quiet spark I hadn't felt in years. I knew what that meeting really meant. They were tightening the circle. The next move would be theirs, and it wouldn't be polite. As soon as I reached the street, I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted email thread with Agent Sophia Reyes. Subject, Whitmore Holdings. Immediate transfer attachment. Full audit trail, plus offshore ledger correlations. Message, they're moving to shut me out. Here's everything I've found. Use it before they bury it. I hit send, then slipped the phone into my coat pocket. The harbor wind was sharp, cutting through my gloves. Somewhere above, behind those mirrored windows, Richard Whitmore believed he'd just silenced me. He had no idea I'd already started talking to someone who could make him listen. The next 48 hours unfolded like the slow pull of a trigger. Once I sent the files to Sophia, there was no undoing it. I didn't expect an immediate response. Government agencies rarely move fast. But by Wednesday morning, the ripples had already begun. At 8:17 a.m., I received a short encrypted message from Sophia. Received. Cross-referencing with Treasury records. This is bigger than we thought. By 11 a.m., another text. FBI Financial Crimes Division looped in. Expect movement soon. Stay low. I stared at the screen, a mixture of anticipation and dread twisting in my stomach. For months, I'd been operating in silence, gathering pieces of the puzzle alone. Now, the machine was awake, and once it started moving, it wouldn't stop. That afternoon, the first call came. Mom. Michael's voice was breathless, anxious. What's going on? Federal agents are at Whitmore Tower. They're questioning employees. Camille just called me. She says Dad's furious. I held the phone closer, but my voice stayed calm. They're probably reviewing the company's financial records. Financial records? Mom, what did you do? My job. There was silence on the other end, the kind that says everything words can't. Mom, he said again, his voice softer now. You're not in trouble, are you? I'm fine, I said, but you might want to start asking your wife a few questions. He exhaled shakily. She says they're targeting us because of politics. That is just a misunderstanding. Michael, I said gently, you were raised to know the difference between a misunderstanding and a lie. Before he could answer, a beep signaled another call coming in. Sophia again. I told him I'd call back and switched lines. Evelyn, Sophia said without preamble, your documentation just opened a door we didn't even know existed. Multiple shell companies, international transfers, false charity records. The Bureau's on it now. Joint Task Force, Financial and Organized Crime. I exhaled slowly. Then it started. It started, she confirmed. You've done your part. Now you need to stay out of sight for a while. I'm not hiding, I said. I've done nothing wrong. That's not the point, she said quietly. People like Richard Whitmore don't lose gracefully. After she hung up, I sat there for a long moment, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Outside, snow drifted past the window in slow, lazy spirals. It should have felt like victory, but it didn't. By evening, the news broke. I was in the living room when the alert flashed across the television screen. Breaking news: federal investigation targets Whitmore Holdings. The anchor's voice was measured but charged with barely concealed excitement. Sources within the Treasury Department confirm that agents have initiated a formal inquiry into alleged offshore tax evasion and money laundering involving one of the nation's largest shipping and energy conglomerates. They showed stock footage of the Whitmore headquarters, the same building where I'd stood just days ago, surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras. Employees hurried through the glass doors, faces pale and tight. A picture of Richard appeared on the screen, then Camille beside him at a charity gala. Perfect smiles, perfect lies. I turned up the volume slightly, not to hear, but to feel. The sound filled the room, the soft static of justice catching up. Somewhere in that building, Richard was watching this same broadcast. Somewhere, Camille was realizing that the web she'd built so carefully was unraveling strand by strand. And yet, instead of satisfaction, I felt something else. A strange, hollow quiet. I reached for the remote, but I didn't turn off the TV. I just sat there on the couch, the flickering light casting shifting patterns across the room. The blue and white glow reflected off the window, off the photo of Michael and me from years ago, back when things were simpler, before wealth and arrogance infected everything it touched. The anchor's voice continued in the background, reciting facts I already knew. Federal agents have seized documents and computers as part of the ongoing investigation. Sources indicate that the operation could implicate several high-ranking executives. I leaned back, hands folded in my lap, and let out a slow breath. This was what I'd wanted. The truth exposed, the system moving, justice in motion. But sitting there in the quiet glow of the television, I realized something no one ever tells you about justice. When you finally get it, it doesn't roar. It whispers. By the time the knock came, I was expecting it. People like the Whitmores never face you themselves. They send someone polished, professional, and paid to look offended on their behalf. When I opened the door, a man in a charcoal suit stood there holding a slim leather briefcase. His voice was smooth, his smile mechanical. "Mrs. Carter," he said, extending a hand I didn't take. "Marcus Blackwell. I represent Mrs. Camille Whitmore and Whitmore Holdings." "Of course you do," I said, stepping aside. "Come in." He glanced around my living room, his gaze briefly pausing on the wine-stained gown hanging by the window, a silent witness to how all of this began. "Charming place," he said. "Peaceful. I imagine you've had a lot of time to reflect?" "I try," I replied. "Tea?" "No, thank you." He placed his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with the precision of a surgeon. "Mrs. Carter, I'll get right to the point. My clients are deeply concerned about your recent actions. It appears that you have breached the confidentiality clause of your consulting agreement." I raised an eyebrow. "Have I?" "Yes," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "By transmitting proprietary information to third parties, specifically federal agents, you have engaged in what could be considered corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and defamation." I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "Those are strong accusations." "They're accurate," he said calmly. "You used privileged access to collect sensitive data for the purpose of harming my clients. That constitutes bad faith and possibly criminal intent." I folded my hands. "And what does Mrs. Whitmore want in return?" "My silence?" Blackwell smiled faintly. She wants fairness, a formal retraction, an agreement not to disclose any further information, and the immediate destruction of any documents in your possession. So, I said, she wants me to erase the truth. He hesitated just long enough to confirm it. She wants to move forward without unnecessary conflict. These things can still be resolved quietly. I stood and walked to the small desk by the window. My files were stacked neatly there, labeled, dated, cross-referenced. I picked up one of the folders, opened it, and laid it on the coffee table between us. Paragraph 9C, I said evenly. It states, the consultant is under no obligation to conceal any activity deemed illegal under U.S. law. Your client's father signed that clause himself. Blackwell's expression flickered, the first crack in his composure. I continued, I did exactly what the contract allowed me to do. I reported what I found. If Whitmore Holdings didn't want their crimes exposed, they shouldn't have hired an investigator with a conscience. He recovered quickly, closing his briefcase with a soft click. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Carter. The Whitmores have considerable resources. They can make life complicated for people who cross them. I'm sure they can, I said. But the truth tends to complicate things more. Blackwell stood, buttoning his jacket. This isn't over. It never is, I replied. But it's getting close. He paused at the door, his professional mask slipping just slightly. You've made powerful enemies. I've made honest choices, I said. There's a difference. After he left, the house fell silent again. I sat down on the couch, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air, sharp and chemical, like fear disguised as confidence. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. A single text from Sophia. It's done. Richard Whitmore taken into custody. 6:00 a.m. raid. I stared at the message, my pulse steady but my chest tight. It had begun. Almost on cue, the television came to life with a breaking news alert. The headline stretched across the bottom of the screen in bold red letters. Whitmore Holdings CEO arrested for fraud and conspiracy. A photo of Richard appeared, handcuffed, expression frozen in disbelief as agents escorted him into a black SUV, and then the next image, Camille, standing outside her mansion, surrounded by flashing cameras, her perfect mask cracking under the weight of reality. The reporter's voice filled the room. Sources confirm that Camille Whitmore, wife of company heir Michael Carter, is under investigation for financial conspiracy and tax fraud related to several nonprofit organizations. I leaned back, the light from the screen flickering across my face. For a moment I felt nothing but stillness, not relief, not joy, just the quiet recognition that the inevitable had finally arrived. Justice never arrives loudly. It slips in through the cracks, steady and unannounced. On the screen, Camille's face turned toward the camera, pale, strained, eyes darting. The same eyes that had once looked at me with smug amusement over a spilled glass of wine. Now they were afraid. For a few days after Richard's arrest, the world around the Whitmores seemed to stop spinning. News vans lined the streets outside their Boston headquarters, reporters shouted questions no one answered, and the company's stock dropped like a stone. Camille disappeared from public view, which should have been the smartest thing she could have done, but Camille Whitmore had never been smart, only clever. And clever people panic when they lose control. 3 days after the headlines broke, I got a call from Sophia. Her tone was clipped, urgent. Evelyn, she said, you might want to sit down for this. I did. What happened? Your daughter-in-law just wired $18 million to 3 separate offshore accounts. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore. We traced it within hours. I closed my eyes. Tell me she didn't. She did, Sophia said, and she just connected Whitmore Holdings to 15 global criminal networks in the process. We'd suspected they were laundering money for international clients. She just gave us the proof. What was she thinking? I murmured. She wasn't, Sophia replied. She was trying to hide assets before they could be frozen. Instead, she lit a signal flare over every illegal transaction her family's ever made. When I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Outside my window, the lake had thawed, patches of dark water breaking through the ice. The storm was coming, and there was no stopping it now. By afternoon, the FBI had moved in. I drove down to Greenwich at Michael's request. He sounded exhausted on the phone, his voice hollow. Mom, they're taking everything, he'd said. Can you come? When I arrived, the scene looked like something from a movie. Black SUVs lined along the street, agents carrying boxes out of the house, neighbors watching from their driveways. The Whitmore crest above the doorway was being photographed as evidence. Michael was standing on the front lawn, his hair disheveled, his face gray. They said Camille moved money offshore, he said numbly as I approached. I didn't believe them. But they showed me the records. Her login, her signature. She moved it herself. I glanced toward the front door, where 2 agents were coming out carrying a jewelry case and a stack of ledgers. They're not wrong, I said quietly. And they're not done yet. He looked at me, eyes hollow. I don't understand any of this. She said it was for legal fees. She said she just wanted to protect what was ours. What was yours? I said gently. Michael, none of this was ever yours. It never belonged to her either. It was built on lies. He looked down, jaw tightening. She lied to me. About everything. Before I could respond, a black SUV pulled up at the curb. 3 agents stepped out, one of them carrying a file. I saw Sophia among them, her coat buttoned tight against the wind. She approached, nodding in greeting. Mrs. Carter, she said quietly. Michael. Michael straightened. Is this really necessary? Can't this wait? Sophia's face softened, but only slightly. I'm afraid it can't. Behind her, 2 agents entered the house. Seconds later, Camille appeared in the doorway, still in her silk robe, her hair hastily tied back. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. No makeup, no performance, no audience to admire her. Just a woman cornered by her own arrogance. Camille Whitmore, one of the agents said, reading from a small card. You are under arrest for obstruction of justice, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Her eyes darted to Michael, wide and desperate. Michael, tell them they're wrong. This is a mistake. They're twisting everything. Michael didn't move. He just stood there watching her, his face unreadable. The agents cuffed her hands behind her back. The metallic click was sharp in the cold air. Please, she said, struggling against their grip. Michael, you know me. I did this for us. I was protecting us. He took a step forward, but his voice was steady when he spoke. You were protecting yourself. She froze, her expression cracking like glass. The agents led her down the walkway toward the waiting car. Flashbulbs went off as photographers caught the moment. The once perfect daughter-in-law, barefoot on the icy pavement, hands bound, mascara streaking down her face. Sophia stepped beside me, her voice low. This will go all the way, Evelyn. We're uncovering records that connect them to drug cartels, human trafficking, illegal arms deals. You did more than expose a fraud. You exposed a network. I didn't respond. I was watching Michael. He was still staring at the empty space where Camille had stood. When the SUV door slammed shut and the convoy pulled away, the sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood. He turned to me finally, voice barely a whisper. It's over, isn't it? Not yet, I said softly, but it will be. We stood there together as the last car disappeared down the street, mother and son, surrounded by the ruins of a life that had never really been theirs. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe. The air was cold, sharp, and honest. The next week unfolded like a slow, rolling earthquake. Every day, new headlines appeared, each one worse than the last. The Whitmore name, once printed in gold on charity banners and business magazines, now appeared in bold red across every major network. Federal probe expands, Whitmore Holdings linked to international crime syndicates. I spent most of those days in quiet coordination with Sophia. My role was mostly done. Now I was just watching the dominoes fall, but even after everything I'd seen, nothing prepared me for the scope of what they uncovered. Sophia called me one evening as I was sitting by the window, the lake outside hidden under thick fog. Her tone was steady, but I could hear the weight in her voice. Evelyn, she said, we've finished the cross-border analysis. It's worse than we thought. How bad? I asked. $3 billion, she replied. That's the total we can trace, laundered through Whitmore Holdings over 15 years. But that's just the money. The real crimes go deeper. They've been moving cash for arms traffickers, organized smuggling rings, even human trafficking operations. Half the subsidiaries you flagged were fronts for shipping illegal goods under legitimate cargo manifests. I didn't speak. For a moment I couldn't. Sophia continued quietly. The Whitmore wedding, your son's wedding, was basically a criminal summit. Representatives from multiple networks were there. The guest list reads like a cross-section of organized crime on the East Coast and beyond. Her words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to absorb. After we hung up, I sat there in the dark, watching my own reflection in the window. The memories came back in sharp fragments, the clinking of glasses, the glimmering chandeliers, the polite laughter that had sounded just a little too rehearsed. And then the image of Camille, smiling as the red wine arced through the air, staining my gown in front of 300 people. I'd spent months believing that humiliation had been personal, a petty act of cruelty from a spoiled woman, but now I saw it differently. The wedding hadn't been a celebration. It had been a show of power, a demonstration for the people in that room, criminals, partners, investors, to prove that the Whitmore family could humiliate anyone, anywhere, and walk away untouched. The spilled wine had been a message. That wine wasn't just humiliation, I whispered. It was a message. Behind me, Michael spoke softly. I hadn't even heard him come in. "What did you say?" I turned to see him standing in the doorway, pale and exhausted, a man hollowed out by truth. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. I repeated, that what happened that night, it wasn't about me. It was about power. He nodded slowly, as if each thought took effort. "Sophia told me everything," he said, "about the money, the companies, the people they worked with. I had no idea." "I know. I should have known," he said bitterly. "I should have seen it." "No," I said softly. "You saw what they wanted you to see." He took a shaky breath and sat down across from me. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things neither of us could fix. For months I'd been angry at him, for his blindness, for his loyalty to Camille, for choosing comfort over truth. But now, watching him struggle to process what he'd lost, I saw something different. Not weakness, just pain. When he finally looked up, his eyes met mine. They were red, tired, but clear. "Mom," he said, the word breaking slightly on his tongue, not defensive this time, not distant, just human. It was the first time in months he'd said it that way. I felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. For the first time, he saw me not as the overbearing mother he'd once resisted, but as the only person who had stood between him and the destruction of everything he thought was real. Outside, the fog began to lift from the lake, revealing the faint shimmer of moonlight on the water. The truth had come at an unbearable cost, but it was still the truth, and that at least was something we could live with. 1 year later, I found myself sitting in a federal courtroom in New York City, the culmination of everything that had begun with a single glass of red wine. The headlines called it the Whitmore case, a federal investigation turned a criminal trial that had shaken the East Coast's financial elite. But for me, it was personal. It was the closing chapter of a story I never wanted to be part of. The courtroom was large but cold, stripped of glamour, filled with quiet tension. Reporters lined the back row, their pens ready. The Whitmores sat at the defense table, Richard in his tailored suit, looking smaller than I remembered, and Camille beside him, dressed in a gray jacket that couldn't quite disguise the arrogance in her posture. When the clerk called my name, I stood, adjusted my jacket, and walked to the witness stand. The oath was familiar: to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I'd built a career around that promise. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh began her questioning. "Mrs. Carter, please tell the court how you first became aware of irregularities within Whitmore Holdings." I looked toward the jury, 12 ordinary people who now held in their hands what entire institutions had failed to do for decades. "It started at a wedding," I said simply. "My son's wedding. I spilled a drop of water on my daughter-in-law's dress. She responded by throwing red wine on my rental gown. $48,000 worth of humiliation." A few jurors smiled faintly, unsure whether to laugh or frown. I continued. "That moment made me curious. People who feel untouchable often are hiding something. So I started looking, and what I found wasn't just arrogance. It was an entire system of corruption, laundering money for people who destroy lives for profit. For 6 hours, I answered every question about the shell companies, the charities, the offshore accounts. I walked them through the paper trails, the false donations, the evidence Richard had unknowingly handed me when he'd offered me a job to keep things quiet. When the defense had their turn, Marcus Blackwell rose. He was polite, precise, and predictably ruthless. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice smooth, "isn't it true that you began this investigation out of personal resentment toward your daughter-in-law?" I met his gaze evenly. "I began it out of curiosity," I said. "I continued it out of moral obligation." He stepped closer. But you admit that this began after a personal slight? Yes, I said, a very expensive one. But humiliation doesn't create evidence, Mr. Blackwell. The Whitmores did that themselves. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. When the prosecution rested, all that was left was for the defendants to speak. Against her lawyer's advice, Camille insisted on testifying. She still believed she could talk her way out of anything, that the same charm which once bent social circles to her will could now disarm a jury. It didn't. For the first 10 minutes she kept her composure, insisting she knew nothing about her father's financial dealings. But then the prosecutor showed the jury her own emails, instructions she had sent authorizing transfers between charities, complete with her digital signature. Her voice cracked. Those were donations, she shouted. Donations to yourself? Walsh asked calmly. To organizations that don't exist? Camille's jaw tightened. Everyone does it, she snapped suddenly. Everyone cheats the system. The only difference is we got caught. The courtroom erupted, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras flashing from the hall. Judge Martinez banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but the damage was done. Camille had confessed, not just to the crimes, but to the mindset that created them. When the verdict came, it was swift and decisive. Guilty on all counts. Richard Whitmore, 45 years, in federal prison. Camille Whitmore, 25 years, without parole. I sat in silence as the sentences were read. Around me, people whispered. Papers rustled, cameras clicked. For everyone else, it was justice served. For me, it was something quieter. The inevitable end of a long, painful truth. When it was over, Michael turned in his seat and looked at me. His expression was unreadable for a moment, somewhere between grief and relief. Then, slowly, he nodded. The afternoon light filtered through the tall courtroom windows, casting faint gold patterns across his face. For the first time since that night at the wedding, I saw the boy he'd been, kind, naive, good-hearted, and the man he was becoming. He didn't say anything, and neither did I, but in that quiet, between judgment and release, I felt something close to peace. 6 months after the trial, the world had moved on, or at least it pretended to. The headlines faded, the news anchors found new scandals to dissect, and Whitmore Holdings was now just a name whispered in business schools as a cautionary tale. But for me, life had slowed into something quieter. The mornings were simple again, coffee, silence, the lake outside my window. I still woke early, the habit of decades I could never unlearn. Some nights I'd dream about numbers, long columns of figures scrolling endlessly across a screen. But when I woke, I reminded myself it was over. One evening in late spring, Michael called. His voice sounded lighter than I'd heard it in years. "Mom," he said, "I'm in the city this week. How about dinner at Romano's?" The same restaurant where Richard Whitmore had tried to buy my silence. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. When I walked in, Michael was already waiting at a small corner table. No expensive suit this time, no trace of the old nervousness that used to define him. Just my son, older, steadier, changed. He stood when he saw me, smiling in a way that carried both apology and peace. "You look good," he said. "So do you," I replied, meaning it. There was something different in his eyes, not guilt anymore, but clarity. Over dinner, he told me about his new life, a modest apartment in Boston, a position with a nonprofit financial watchdog group. "Feels strange, working to prevent the same kind of crimes I once ignored," he said with a wry smile. "Strange," I said, "but fitting." He nodded, stirring his coffee. "I've cut all ties with the Whitmores. Sold the house, closed the accounts, changed my number. I'm starting over." "That's a good place to start," I said. "Truth makes for solid ground." For a while, we sat in comfortable silence, something we hadn't shared in years. The restaurant around us buzzed with quiet conversation, clinking glasses, the soft hum of normal life continuing. Then Michael leaned back and looked at me. "Mom," he said softly, "any regrets?" I smiled faintly. "No. Regret is for people who stop halfway." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You never do anything halfway." "I try not to," I said, sipping my coffee. After a pause, his smile turned teasing. "Next time I get married?" I raised an eyebrow. "I'll run a background check on her entire bloodline." He laughed, a real laugh this time, the kind that starts small and grows into something that fills the air. It had been a long time since I'd heard it. For a moment, it felt like everything heavy between us, the silence, the distance, the things unsaid, just lifted. We stayed until the restaurant began to empty, neither of us in a hurry to leave. When we finally stepped outside, the air was warm, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. Michael hugged me before getting into his car, holding on a little longer than usual. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said. I smiled. "I'm proud of you too, Michael. You chose the truth. That's never easy." He nodded, his voice quiet. "You taught me how." As he drove away, I stood there for a while, watching the taillights disappear into the evening. The world felt quieter now, not empty, but peaceful. The kind of peace that only comes when you've walked through fire and realized you're still standing. And for the first time since that wedding, I wasn't thinking about the Whitmores or the dress or the wine. I was thinking about beginnings. The morning light over Lake Champlain was soft, the kind that doesn't rush you, the kind that waits. Vermont in early summer has a stillness that feels earned. The air smelled faintly of pine and rain, and the water mirrored the pale pink of dawn. I sat on the porch of my cottage, a cup of coffee in hand, listening to the first bird song of the day. The trial, the headlines, the noise, all of it felt distant now, like a story that had happened to someone else. Inside, the house was quiet. On the wall by the window hung the dress, cleaned, pressed, and carefully stored in a clear garment bag. The silver beading caught the morning light, glimmering softly. The red stain was gone, mostly, but not entirely. A faint blush of pink still ran along the hem, too stubborn to fade. I kept it that way on purpose, a reminder, not of anger, but of truth. That dress had started it all. It was more than silk and thread. It was evidence, humiliation, awakening, the moment I realized that silence protects the wrong people. For a long time, I thought revenge was what I wanted. But as the months passed, I understood something simpler. Justice isn't about payback, it's about balance. And sometimes the only way to restore balance is to stop pretending you're powerless. I'd spent 30 years of my life tracking numbers, exposing lies that others were too afraid to see. I thought retirement would mean rest. Instead, it gave me purpose again, just not the kind I'd planned. The world kept turning. The Whitmore name was gone from the business pages, replaced by other scandals, other empires built on the same fragile arrogance. But I no longer cared. I'd done what I came to do. I'd told the truth, loudly enough that no one could ignore it. The phone on the table buzzed with a message from Michael, a photo of his new office, small but bright, captioned simply, "Day 1." I smiled. That was the real victory, not the headlines, not the verdicts, but the quiet resilience of starting over. A gentle breeze rippled across the lake, catching the light just right so that the water shimmered like glass. I set my cup down, folded my hands, and watched the sun break fully over the horizon. The pink reflection spread across the surface of the lake, the same soft hue that lingered on the edge of my dress. Funny, I thought, how stains fade but never vanish completely. Maybe they're not meant to. Maybe they're how we remember what not to forget. I stood, stretched, and glanced once more at the dress hanging on the wall. "Camille Whitmore tried to humiliate me," I said quietly, the words steady and certain. Instead, she handed me the case of a lifetime. I smiled, the morning light warming my face. Some women retire quietly. I retired loudly. Outside, the birds grew louder, their song echoing over the water. The sun climbed higher, and the faint pink of the lake turned gold. For the first time in a long time, everything felt exactly as it should.